Hey guys, last time we talked about the efficiency curve between resistances and health for tanks so that tanks can kind of curve into their build optimally by buying health when it's efficient to buy health in order to maximize their effective HP, or buy resistances when it's important for them to buy resistances or gold efficient for them to do so to maximize their effective HP. One thing that people brought up that we didn't really get into is this kind of X factor of tanks having a HP ratio in their ability scaling. And this is a good point, right? Braum has it in his Q, for example. And I tend not to think about it a whole lot on Braum because it's just a flat, small amount that you wouldn't really over-index on health too much to benefit from the extra damage on your Q. But for other champions that might have a max HP ratio based on their own maximum HP, I think maybe Maokai Sapling is like this. It can actually represent a significant amount of damage, and so it can push that champion's curve, towards the health side a little bit. So they might benefit even more from building more health. There are some champions that even benefit from having more armor or magic resist. Think like Taric or Malphite. Braum may even give more armor or magic resist on his W, but to be honest, I don't even know. Braum main, by the way, probably the best in NA. But that being said, today we're going to be talking about AD carries, and we're going to be taking a look at a specific example in Kaisa. And unfortunately, we don't see these nice charts floating around for AD carry, and we're going to be talking about why, but we're going to be doing our best. I tried. It's very, very difficult to construct one of these charts, and there's a lot of nuance anyways, so we're going to get the gist of what this chart would be like for Kaisa, but I do not have a pretty chart for you, I'm sorry, but we do have lots of math, so hopefully I'll explain all of that. Real quick, though, to cap up on the last one, I did want to show one example because we took a lot of looks at cloth armor, and some people might think that no magic mantle would fare better compared to ruby crystal, obviously because of the cost, since they're the same cost and you're getting more magic resist as opposed to getting, a little bit less armor with cloth armor, but also because you're in a real world example, which we were looking at on Braum, you have less magic resist. And so maybe the fact that you're, under indexed on magic resist, even though actually you're not, you're way under indexed on health at the start of the game, right? But the fact that you don't have as much magic resist as armor, maybe that means, no magic mantle would fare better. And it does not. So in this example, you can see that we have like 675 HP at level 1, 47 armor, and 32 magic resist. And we have 992 effective HP against 100% physical damage. And then against a 50-50 mixed damage team comp, being 50% physical damage done to you, 50% magic damage, you have 942 effective HP. If you go back and you buy the ruby crystal for 400 gold, you end up with 1200 effective HP against all physical and 1151 against mixed damage. Whereas if you buy the 20 magic resist here and jump from 32 to 52 magic resist, but your HP stays the same against 100% physical, obviously you're getting no benefit. So, you're doing a lot worse than if you bought ruby crystal, and you're getting no benefit at all there. And then against magic damage, even against magic damage, because you're very early on into the game at level 1 and and onward, you really need that 1700 to 1800 HP before resistances are really even worth buying, even at 30 or 40 resistances. And so because of that, you can see that even against magic damage, you're at 1000 effective HP with no magic mantle versus 1100 with the ruby crystal. And so you can see that's 3 times as much effective HP that you're gaining in 209 versus 68 with the ruby crystal. And then of course you're gaining nothing against physical with no magic mantle, whereas you're gaining 221. So the division just doesn't work out, because technically this is an infinitely higher amount of effective HP against physical damage. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at what we learned about Kaisa. Now, what I did learn is that this is quite complicated. For one, AD carries runes are much more complicated than tanks, because tanks will get HP and, well, it's just, usually you're just getting some form of just straight up HP. Maybe actually Overgrowth works similarly to some of the AD carry runes, but I'm so familiar with it that I was able to do a better job estimating it, let's say. But regardless, that's one thing, is if you're building Lethal Tempo, if you're building Legend Alacrity in your runes, those things are going to kind of complicate the DPS curve that you would build on any AD carry champion. The other thing is that, and this should be, pretty obvious, but since different AD carry champions have different attack speed ratios, this is the main reason why you don't see a chart like this that's so nice and uniform across all AD carry champions, because certain AD carries are going to have a different balance between when it's gold efficient for them to buy, in terms of maximizing their DPS, when it's gold efficient for them to buy attack speed, and when it's gold efficient for them to buy attack damage. And so that's going to, completely change the game. Like I've said before, every single AD carry champion would have a different curve to maximize their DPS. The other issue is that even if you do have the curve, it's not as straightforward as it seems, because of this kind of X factor, which is your abilities and the ratios that you get, and even just how they function. So, for example, think of a champion like Lucian. Well, Lucian doesn't benefit from attack speed as much as he benefits from attack damage, because the way that his passive works gives him those 2 auto attacks per ability that he uses. And he's also a caster AD carry who benefits more from AD ratios, because he has a lot of AD ratios on his abilities and multiple abilities with them. So a champion like Lucian, even if he was just sitting there auto attacking you over and over again, his DPS curve, if we built it for him, would show that you should be buying a certain amount of attack speed at certain break-even points. In actuality, if you take into account how his kit works, and now we're taking into account not just him standing there auto-attacking, but him actually using his abilities in a game, obviously itemizing much more heavily into AD would benefit Lucian a lot. This is true, like we talked about with tanks, but it's really, really true with AD carries, because their abilities are meant to deal damage a lot of times. So caster AD carries, champions that have 2 or 3 AD ratios, especially if they're strong AD ratios, 100% plus, quite important for them to actually over-index on attack damage than their DPS curve would suggest. But that doesn't mean that we can't still take away lots of important information from trying to construct a DPS curve for an AD carry champion, even if they might want to lean one way or another based on their kit. Can go the other way too. So Kaisa, the champion that we're going to look at, might actually want to lean into attack speed because of the fact that her passive is giving her extra damage on attack. And so she benefits from having more attack speed, because she's making up for some of the lack of AD by doing extra magic damage on her auto attacks through her passive. But that being said, that might be counteracted by the fact that she has significant AD ratios on her Q, especially if you're using it in isolation properly, and a significant AD ratio, 130% on her W. And while it doesn't help maximize her damage, it's still important utility that she actually has quite a good AD ratio on her shield on her ult. So she's going to benefit a little bit from that as well, though that's minor, I would say, compared to the other things. So there's a lot going on here, right? We have just some notes here that I wrote down to keep track of everything, is that you're going to have to keep in mind lethal tempo, stacking alacrity, and when that's going to happen, and that's going to be different in different games. A champion's abilities and their AD ratios that they have on abilities, or maybe benefiting from attack speed in some way. and things like Kaisa passive or on hit damage and stuff like that. Some champions will have attack speed built into their kit, like maybe MF has attack speed built into her kit with her W, or Draven has attack speed built into his kit with his W. And so maybe those champions, when they use that, if they're using that optimally or a lot, maybe they're going to be able to lean heavier into AD because they're getting attack speed when they need it from one of their abilities. Those champions also benefit from heavy AD ratios, and so they'd want to build more AD. So it does get a little bit complicated, but here's what I learned about Kaisa. So another really interesting thing that I learned when I was putting this together is I thought this would be relatively straightforward, because you take the amount of AD that you have at a certain level or time in the game and you multiply it against the attack speed that you have. Pretty simple, right? Not so straightforward. One of the things that I learned that I actually didn't know, and this applies to all stats that you gain per level, not just attack speed, but all stats that you gain per level. So it could be health, armor, magic resist, any stat that you gain per level. You actually don't gain the same amount per level. So let's say Braum gains 93 HP going from level 2 to level 3 or something like that. When he goes from level 9 to 10, he's going to gain like 100 instead of 93 per level. And so it's going to go up each time. We can see this with Kaisa. If we go to her wiki, that we start out with 0% bonus attack speed at level 1, that we get 1.3% bonus attack speed at level 2, that we get another 1.3 going from 2 to 3. So we go from 1.33 to 2.66, which is double that. But then we don't jump to 3.99. Instead, we go to 4.08. So we're getting an extra 0.009 or whatever, or 0.09. And then we keep going up and it keeps getting worse. Now all of a sudden we've jumped, like a whole forget what it was exactly, but something like 1.4% or something like that, nearly 1.5%. And so we're not getting our bonus attack speed per level at the same rate. And this was really confusing because, as I said, so different AD carry champions have different attack speed ratios, but apparently, and this is for all stats that you get, when you see this, growth coefficient, we can look for Kaisa on here. I saw 1.8% and assumed this was 1.8% per level, but it's actually not. And maybe it's just because maybe this is an average of 1.8% per level, but actually you start out only gaining like 1.33, and then it gets higher and higher and higher and higher. So in total, I do believe you'll gain the 30.6% attack speed if you were to reach level 18. But this isn't actually how it works. You're not actually getting 1.8% per level. And so apparently there's a whole equation for every stat that you get in the game, which is right here. It's this part of this equation, which is there's some just constant numbers here. And it's multiplied by your current level minus 1. And essentially, you just gain more of everything for each level that you gain, the higher you're going. And so that was something that I didn't expect. So that's kind of interesting to note. Another really interesting thing to note is that actually, and this is going to sound crazy, all champions actually have the same base attack speed. I know that that's another thing that doesn't really sound like it makes sense here, but actually there's an equation for base attack speed in League, and the base attack speed is the same for every champion, but each champion has an attack speed windup, which is the time it takes them to cast their auto attack, and that is actually what is subtracted from every champion's same base attack speed to give them a different attack speed ratio. So what actually creates different attack speed ratios in League is the wind-up animation to cast your auto attack. So this is also something I didn't know. So when we go to actually calculate this, what I did is I just started with, 4 different scenarios: level 1, level 2, level 9, level 18. I wanted to give us a broad range. Obviously, it would be better if we did every single level, but it would take a long time to look at. This gives us a perfectly good idea, though. We wouldn't get much else from looking at different things. And actually, I dropped the analysis on level 2 because it's so close to level 1. So we can see here that on Kaisa, we have a base AD of 59, and we're getting our adaptive force in our runes that is giving us 5.4 AD. And then we get, just add those two together and get a total amount of AD. When it comes to attack speed, we have our base attack speed, and then we have this 13% attack speed. And the 13% attack speed is coming from the 3% flat that you get from the rune alacrity, and the 10% that you get from the attack speed shard, the stat shard. Then it gets plugged into this gigantic equation based on her base attack speed, her attack speed ratio, which luckily for Kaisa is the same as her base attack speed, which is true for a decent chunk of champions, but not always the case. And then based on this just like coefficient that they use, just this random flat number essentially, I mean, I'm sure it's not exactly random, that determines how much of a stat you get per level, that creates this effect of you gaining more of a stat per level, which kind of makes sense intuitively because it does take more XP and take longer to hit each leveling point. But anyways, this is an interesting revelation to me. For example, we talked about, I don't mean to sidetrack too much, but we talked about, like power spikes in League, for example. And not that this is a crazy change in the thinking about this, but if you gain more for getting more XP, then maybe your power spike in terms of stats when you go from level, 7 to 8 is quite impactful and big, or bigger than I would have thought, just as going from, I guess like level 1 to 2 is not a great example because the main power spike from that is you gaining access to an extra ability. But let's say going from level 3 to 4 might be just as impactful as going from level 7 to 8, or going from level 6 to 7, because at 6 you already have your point in your ult. That might be, potentially just as impactful. Maybe not quite, but definitely closer in terms of impact than I would have thought before understanding this. So that's kind of big. So all we did to figure out how this works is we took into account that for every 1 gold that we get, and this sounds weird, but this is how you have to reverse things in order to create that chart, is it's not based on you buying 1 AD versus 1% attack speed. It's based on you spending each unit of gold, right? So if you buy 1 gold, you get 1/35 of an AD. That's because if you, spend, 350 gold, you get 10 AD. So that's where that comes from, obviously from longsword. Same thing with the attack speed. If you spend 1 gold, you get, instead of thinking about it as like, you spend 250 gold, you get 10% attack speed. Instead, we're thinking about it the opposite way around. You spend 1 gold, you get 1/25 of a percent of attack speed. Now that's kind of confusing too because it's a percentage. So as you'll see here, it's not really 1/25, it's 1 out of 2,500. And then all we're doing is we're taking these little equations here, and because it's so small, if you were to only do each 1 additional unit, if we were trying to make that graph, we want to do each 1 additional unit of gold spent. But just to get the gist, I wanted to see bigger differences so that we could actually see what's happening with some real numbers. So I used 300. So if you spent 300 gold on attack speed, this would be like buying the old dagger, or like in theory, if you could buy a little bit more of a dagger now, and instead of having to dish out the 350 on longsword or whatever, you spend the 300. Is longsword actually even 350, or is longsword just straight up 300 now? I don't even know. Coach, by the way. But anyways, regardless, the math is correct. Whether I, trust me, I looked up longsword when I did this. Let's see, longsword league. Let's just take a look. Yeah, it's still 350. Okay, we're chilling. Yeah, which is why this is 135th instead of 130th. Okay, anyways, I'm just double checking we're not completely griefing here. So what we would do is we would take this, for example, and we'd look at our DPS. So what we do is we take our total attack damage and we, use this big equation to find out what our actual total attack speed is. And we multiply our total AD finally by our total attack speed and or attacks per second, right, that we're getting. And we get our DPS, which in this case at level 1 on Kaisa with, your basic alacrity, 1 adaptive force, 1 attack speed is going to be 50 damage per second. Now, obviously, not taking abilities into account, her passive, things like that, etc. Like I said, that really complicates things, and we'll have to, take that into account in our actual thinking about it. But the math is the math, right? So then we take these numbers, and for example, if we want to add 300 gold worth of attack damage, we can just come over here into the runes and items category, and we can just plug this in. I think I messed up by adding a parenthesis. Oops. Oh, we need an equal sign is what the problem is. Well, anyways, I already went through all of this, so I'm just showing how it works. But we can see that when we add this equation in, we went from 50 to 56. So here we were at 50 DPS. If we add in 300 gold worth of attack damage, oh, it didn't work again. Then we go from 50 to 56. So, we don't need to mess with all of this. This is what I went through. What we can see is that at level 1 on Kaisa with your standard runes, assuming that you don't have any extra stacks towards alacrity, just the flat amount, not taking her abilities or passive into account, and not considering lethal tempo, which we will get to lethal tempo in a second because we've run through examples with lethal tempo stacked. If you spend 300 gold on AD, it'll give you an increase of 6 DPS. Whereas if you spend 300 gold on attack speed, it'll give you an increase of 8 DPS. So when you go back on Kaisa level 1, barring these other things that you would need to take into account, it would be beneficial to buy a dagger over a longsword. That's very important to know, right? Like when you go back on Kaisa level 1, as long as those other things either balance out or favor attack speed, you should be buying dagger first, not longsword. So that's very, very important information, right? But we're not really at that conclusion stage yet, but that would be what these numbers suggest right off the bat. But we will run through like, okay, well, does lethal tempo, then the question would be, does lethal tempo favor attack speed or attack damage? Is lethal tempo giving you more attack damage than is efficient and less attack speed, or is it giving you more attack speed and less attack damage? And the answer is that lethal tempo actually gives you more attack speed and less attack damage. So that will help to compensate for that slightly. So it will reduce the difference in benefit to your DPS and your auto attacks that you get from building more attack speed or attack damage. Although there's an argument in and of itself to be made, I just realized this on the fly, by the way, that to even stack up lethal tempo, which gives you both adaptive force or attack damage and attack speed, you benefit from having more attack speed to do that, because more attack damage is not going to help you stack lethal tempo faster, but more attack speed will. So again, it gets really confusing with AD carry compared to tanks to try to figure this out. But that might suggest actually then that even though we can see down here, you get 24 adaptive force and 24% attack speed, which is a little bit misleading because it looks like it's kind of giving you the same thing, but of course, adaptive force only gives you 0.6%, or not percent, but it gives you 0.6 AD per adaptive force that you have. So 60% of this is actually going to be AD. So you get 14.4 attack damage and 24% attack speed. If we just do some basic thinking about this, so dagger is now 10% attack speed. It used to be 12% attack speed, but same efficiency ratio. So when it cost 300, like the percentage that the attack speed dropped by was the same as the cost. So essentially they're equivalent, which is one of the reasons why, it's fine to do all of this. But, you essentially, we can think about this in terms of two old daggers, right? And if we just think about the math behind that, two old daggers would have been the equivalent to, so this would be 600 gold worth of attack speed. And, so this is 600 gold worth of attack speed. So how much gold is, the question would be, 14.4 AD, how much gold is that worth? So we know that a longsword is giving 10 AD for 350, so it's 35 gold per AD. So 14.4 times 35 would be 504 gold worth of attack damage. So we can see that lethal tempo kind of over-indexes you on attack speed, which makes sense because people who are using lethal tempo in order to stack it in the first place are probably champions that want more attack speed than attack damage. And it's not that big of a difference, so it's fine. But obviously lethal tempo is going to, as you can see, mitigate. So the more you have lethal tempo stacked, the more it's going to mitigate the difference between whether it's worth it for you to buy attack damage or buy attack speed. But it's never going to change it completely, at least. Well, I mean, I could in a very thin situation, but for the most part, not in any of these examples. Okay, so then at level 9, the other question we have is, okay, well, does it change as you level up? Like, does Kaisa gain more attack damage in terms of gold efficiency or more attack speed in terms of gold efficiency when she levels up? Does the gap shrink or close as she levels up? And the answer is that we can see here that at level 9, she has 8 DPS by buying AD, but 10 DPS if she buys attack speed, and 8 DPS at level 18 for buying the attack damage, but 13 DPS for buying the same amount of attack speed. And this is even including, there was a big change here. We jumped, so the AD is constant, just the basic adaptive force that we get in our runes. But we actually, and I don't know exactly when this happens, and it changes game to game because you can get stacks for getting assists and stuff like that. But I assume that you stack Legend Alacrity by level 9 in this example. So level 9 and level 18 include a fully stacked Legend Alacrity. And what that's going to mean is that the attack speed is actually more worthwhile as you're leveling up. In other words, you're getting more gold worth of AD as you're leveling up on Kaisa than you are getting attack speed. And so it becomes more worth it to buy attack speed the more you're leveling in terms of maximizing your DPS, despite the fact that you're gaining a bunch of extra attack speed from Alacrity. So if you were to take runes out of the equation, just talk about the champion at its core or at its base, Kaisa would benefit even more from building attack speed. So far what we're seeing is that attack speed is like quite good. And if we're just thinking about no passive, no abilities yet, but even taking into account the runes, right, we're going to want to buy the same amount of gold worth of attack speed as we want to buy gold worth of AD. So when we're thinking about our items like Static Shiv or something like that, I didn't even really get into this, but let's see if we can find it. So if we think about static shiv, it's hard to say exactly how much we're spending on what, but we can try to look at it, right? Well, we can just go based off of the stats that it's giving. So let's just assume that they are just standard gold efficient. So if we're buying 50 attack damage, that's going to be 35 per attack damage. So we're getting 1,750 worth of attack damage. And if we go, I think we have gold efficiency here. If we go and we look at dagger, it's 25 gold per, so per percent, I believe. So 35 times 25. So this is a big deal, right? Like, let's say we're buying static shiv. We're buying 1,750 gold worth of attack damage, and yet we're only buying 875 gold worth of attack speed. So this is a big deal, right? Attack damage is more expensive than attack speed, and yet we're buying more attack damage than we are buying attack speed in an item like static shiv. So that's quite interesting, right? In an item like Kraken Slayer, it's a little bit more balanced, right? We're still over-indexing on attack damage, but we're actually getting, way more gold worth of attack speed, relatively speaking. I guess actually we're kind of getting less of both, right? And then hopefully we're making up for that with the rest of the item. Because actually we're getting less attack damage and we're only getting 5% more attack speed with Kraken. But you get the idea, right? We're starting to think about these questions of, okay, if Kaisa is leveling up and gaining more gold worth of AD from her base champion level ups, and the numbers suggest that all the way level 1 through 18, not taking account like what we're doing in terms of our items and all this stuff, what I'm basically seeing is that we're under-indexed on attack speed on Kaisa. Well, if you look at like the builds that people are going on Kaisa, like we just looked at the first item, right? It's even worse. Because when we take a look at the build on Kaisa, if we're going static or Kraken first, both of these items give more attack damage than attack speed. So after we finish Kraken or static, we need an item preferably. Now again, you're going to build the items that do other things for you. So again, Kaisa has AD ratios on her Q and her W, so maybe leaning a little bit too much into attack damage is okay. Right, where she doesn't really benefit a whole lot, although she does benefit from attack speed on her passive, right? So how big of a difference that is, I don't exactly know, right? I do know that for sure most of Kaisa's damage is coming from her passive and her Q. Her W is mostly useful for applying passive stacks if you're going AD Kaisa, applying multiple passive stacks with it, and just dealing a decent chunk of damage as an ability. But there's a couple of things there. It's important not to confuse the whole amount of damage that you're doing with the ability versus the amount of damage that you're doing with the ability that's just coming from your AD ratio. Although Kaisa's W does have a pretty decent AD ratio. But for example, it could be very easy to say, I don't know, take a champion like Karma. This is probably not the best example, so the numbers don't have to be perfect. But let's say you have a support champion like Karma. Now, her Q's actually probably got some stupid busted AP ratio because that does a ton of damage. But generally speaking, a support champion, I don't know, you could say let's say Karma. Let's say that a huge amount, her Q does a ton of damage, but most of it is just base damage or coming from her R. And very little of it is like her AP ratio. Maybe she actually only has like a 30 or 40% AP ratio. You can put aware here because it's probably something stupid like 80%. But it should be, and there are champions where maybe their ability does a ton of damage, but actually the AP ratio or the AD ratio is only like 30%. In that case, just because that ability is the main area where your damage is coming from doesn't mean that you should over-index on AD just because that ability does a ton of damage or does a ton of physical or magic damage, because all you care about is the amount of extra damage that you're getting from the AD that you're buying. And if it has a low ratio, then it has a low ratio, right? But anyway, so we'd want to buy our next item that gives us more attack speed than attack damage. So we can see here pretty much everybody's going Rageblade as the second item after one of these two. So we're over-indexing on AD. And then since Rageblade, well, okay, maybe actually the passive on Rageblade might make up for it. I was going to say we're actually over-indexing again on AD, but it does seem like maybe Rageblade's passive attacks granting 8% attack speed for 3 seconds, stacking up to 4 times. You know, obviously you could get, 32% attack speed from that if you've got it fully stacked. So that could be quite big. Although even with that, you might say, okay, you have the other part of the passive, every third attack applies on-hit effects twice, which is interesting because obviously you want more attack speed to do that. And if you've got on-hit effects like Kaisa passive, for example, that benefits from more attack speed. So, I don't quite know. So let's say that you have this fully stacked and you've got 32% attack speed. So even with 32% attack speed, let's just compare here. Let's say we've got 35% attack speed and 25% attack speed is 60% attack speed. And let's say we've got a fully stacked Rageblade and now we're getting an extra, so we've got 60 and now we're getting an extra 32. So we have something like 92% attack speed with the Rageblade passive stacked. But we also have 50 attack damage. And so the magic number we were looking for was 96? I think I said 92 for some reason, but 96 anyways. So 50 attack damage here. With 30, we're going to 80, but also the Wrath deals 30 bonus magic damage on hit. So we're going from 80 to 110. So even with Rageblade passive fully stacked, which is super conditional, not the hardest thing to get all the way stacked, but you're not there immediately. So you're dropping some DPS, right? Even with Rageblade passive fully stacked, we're still over-indexed on attack damage on Kaisa. Although, if you were picking up, let's say, Berserker's Greaves, that can help because then you're getting 25% attack speed here. And now between these items, now we're talking about, moving from 92% to, or 96%, to 101, 121, 121%. And that's about as close as you can get to being in line, to be honest, because if you think about that, one thing I was going to say is the attack damage and the attack speed. I'm just thinking about it in my head as, if they're even, but we know that obviously the attack damage costs more. So even if you had 100 AD, that would be 3,500 gold worth of AD. Whereas if you had 100% attack speed, that would be 2,500 gold worth of attack speed. So even if the numbers are even, you're still under indexed on attack speed, right? Let's see, what about the next item? Maybe that's one of the reasons why Nashor's is so good on Kaisa, is because you're not getting, except you do get damage on hit. But I'm sure it's not that high, right? Yeah, it's not that high. So one of the things about completing Nashor's Tooth on Kaisa then after that is it's giving 50% attack speed but no AD. Now it is giving magic damage on hit, so it's giving, which essentially counts as AD, because again, it doesn't really matter whether it's doing magic or physical. That just matters when it's calculating the enemy's resistances. What matters to you is that you're dealing a certain amount per auto attack. So on hit effects, whether magic or not, are basically counting towards you the same way as AD would. Not in terms of your abilities, but we haven't even gone there, right, as part of the way that we're thinking about this. So one of the nice things about building Nashor's Tooth after that is if we are a little bit under indexed on attack speed, now we're getting 50% attack speed and no AD, but we do get a little bit of damage on hit that kind of counts like that, but nowhere near the 50%. We're getting, 15 plus 15% AP. So I don't know exactly how much you're going to have. Did Rageblade give AP? It must, right? A little bit. Yeah, it gives 30. So you have like 100. So maybe this is more like 30. You're probably still, even with Nashor's, you're probably still just slightly over-indexed on hit / AD, especially when we start again taking Kaisa passive into account and stuff like that. But again, maybe it's okay to be a little bit over-indexed on AD because of her Q and her W and all of this stuff. So let's go back to the analysis and kind of run through the rest of these numbers, and then we'll kind of start to get to some conclusions here. So we can see that, we already talked about this. Even as you're leveling up, attack speed is actually becoming more valuable. So you're getting more attack damage for leveling in terms of gold value than you're getting attack speed on Kaisa, is essentially what that's telling us. And then here we did the same, run, except with lethal tempo fully stacked. So we already know, though, that the result is that this is just going to minimize these differences a little bit, because it's going to give us more gold worth of attack speed than it is going to give us gold worth of attack damage. And so we can see here that actually buying AD or buying attack speed at level 1, if you've got a fully stacked lethal tempo, the attack damage buy versus the dagger buy is basically well, actually, I shouldn't say that. Really important to note that just like Ruby Crystal versus Cloth Armor, Ruby is better for multiple reasons. But one factor, like we talked about, is the fact that it is more expensive. So each point of gold that you're spending with a fully stacked lethal tempo on Kaisa at level 1, each point of gold that you spend on AD is giving you about the same amount as a point of gold on attack speed. But of course, if you can buy the more expensive component, that's going to give you more of either stat, even if it was suggesting that you should buy, for example, back here, even without lethal tempo fully stacked, maybe you get 8 DPS for spending 300 gold on a dagger and 6 DPS for spending 300 gold on a longsword, but you can't spend 300 gold on a longsword or a dagger, right? You're going to spend 350 on a longsword versus 250 on the dagger. And so maybe this, 2 AD goes away and you're actually getting the same amount of value because the dagger is just a more expensive component. So that's also very important to keep in mind. So in this situation, where it's even between spending an additional point of gold on attack damage versus attack speed, you definitely want to buy the dagger, definitely want to buy the longsword, the AD, because of the fact that you're getting more, just that it's a more expensive component, you're getting more stats. Okay, so then, let me move over here too. So then, we get into like some higher levels with stacked lethal tempo, and we can see that even though lethal tempo favors attack speed in giving you more gold worth of attack speed than AD, you can actually still see that it's still suggesting that spending an additional 300 gold versus on attack speed versus AD is still giving you way more of a benefit by buying attack speed than buying attack damage. So again, really the question comes down to then at the end of the day is, do you think that Kaisa benefits more from being able to attack faster to get more damage off of her passive, and because the attack speed is obviously something that in her current build she's maybe a little bit under indexed on, and that she benefits more from attack speed, the higher up in level she's going, and all of these things despite runes? how well do her current items curve her? I would actually say, given the options, I mean, I don't know what exactly all the options are, but Kaisa is also balancing another factor, which is she also has to buy certain stats in order to evolve her abilities. And so that's very important as well, right? Like maybe you want to spend the same amount of gold on attack speed as you do on AD, or maybe you even want to spend a little bit more gold on attack speed on Kaisa. And yet, in order to get your Q evolve and your your E evolve, in order to get those two things, you need to buy the same amount of attack damage as attack speed, which is even more gold into attack damage. So it's a very, very complicated situation with a lot of these AD carry champions, because it comes down to, well, okay, is there a build I could go that still gives me the important evolves that I want while giving me more attack speed maybe than the traditional build? Honestly, it looks like Kaisa's items curve her pretty decently, so I don't think that there's anything crazy going on here, but you can see how there are certainly AD carry champions that, despite their abilities and all of these other things, that might benefit from building slightly differently just in order to maximize their DPS and build better along the DPS efficiency curve. The other thing, of course, that you might run into, but maybe people would already know this in terms of common sense when building components like we talked about, is since you're benefiting way more from putting gold into attack speed in all of these situations, as long as you can spend the same amount of gold on attack speed. Let's say you're in a situation where you're choosing between a longsword or 2 daggers, right? Better to buy the 2 daggers than to buy the longsword. And maybe that makes intuitive sense to people because it allows you to spend more gold, but that would definitely be the case, because if you could spend 300 gold on AD and 300 gold on attack speed on Kaisa, ignoring whether her passive is stronger if she gets more attack speed versus her Q being stronger if she gets more attack damage, and her W being stronger if she gets more attack damage. We don't really know the answer to that. That's kind of complicated. That might be a thing to just go in and, to a practice tool game with a target dummy and see, to try to figure out, like, in game, where you're seeing both your Q and your and your passive being utilized. You'd sit there and you'd auto attack the target dummy so that your passive is being applied, but you're also using Q on cooldown, and you see what's going on there, because then you might get a bit of a different answer, right? Although keep in mind, right, that not every Q you take on Kaisa, especially in lane, is going to be isolated, whereas you're going to get all isolated Qs against the target dummy probably. So keep that in mind. Like, that's obviously going to look like it favors her AD ratio, because her AD ratio is so good on her Q if she can get an isolated Q, because it's a very difficult thing to do, and it's one of the core skill points of Kaisa is finding those isolated Qs in lane, or taking skirmishes where you're in the jungle and you can, or in the river, and you can get those isolated Qs easier. That's obviously a big skill on Kaisa. But the point is, when you're thinking about component items, I mean, think about even like pickaxe, right? So that would be the next one that I'd want to think about, is if we're looking at items like static shiv and stuff like that. Static shiv has pickaxe. It's got scout slingshot and rectrix. In general, the way I think about these items is I generally prefer, like most good Kaisa players, probably like Rectrix I think is just really incredibly good, and then pickaxe, and then scout slingshot is kind of trash. But you might consider, so if you can spend 500 gold on daggers, let's think about if we're buying boots too. So, like let's say we're going Berserker's Greaves. If we're going Berserker's Greaves, we can, buy a bunch of daggers. We could buy 4 daggers if we wanted. Two towards Scout Slingshot and 2 towards our boots now, I believe. So we could buy 1,000 gold worth of daggers. Is 1,000 gold worth of daggers better than 875 gold towards pickaxe? The answer is yes. Well, here's a kind of a tough question, and maybe we can answer this real quick actually by playing with the numbers here in the sheet. But let's say you buy 3 daggers. So you have this would be 750 gold, right? Is 750 gold better than a Retrix if you're just putting it into 3 daggers on Kaisa? And is it even better than pickaxe, even though pickaxe is a little bit more expensive than that? We can kind of plug and play with that. So if we were to buy 3 daggers, that would be like, for example, 750 gold. Let's keep this separate. So we can take a look at, like hypothetical examples. So like, let's say that, for example, we spent 750 gold on attack speed. So this would be 3 daggers, while we're building in, versus like a Retrix obviously gives us, I want to compare it to pickaxe because Retrix obviously gives us some movement speed. And so that 4% movement speed is something that, is obviously going to take away from the item's effectiveness, but is still quite strong depending on how much you value movement speed. So let's compare it to pickaxe. So 875, you gain 25 AD. So we don't even need to specify the cost. Let's just say that you gain 25 AD, right? So let's just answer this question really quickly, like components, so we can at least walk away with something, right? So let's take a look here at the same situation, and we're going to add AD and see what happens. So if we add 25 AD, which we would get from a pickaxe, we're going to watch our DPS go from 50 right here to 69. So nice. So we went from 50 to 69, so we gained 19 DPS. And we can just note that there. And then we can take that away. And then we're going to come to the attack speed. And we're going to need to use this little thing because but we're going to have to change the 300 gold amount to 750. And we're going from 50 to 69. So really interesting to note there, right, that they're actually equal. And I wonder if we look at decimals, can we get like a definitive answer? But obviously they're very close. So you probably wouldn't have thought that before, right? That you're actually gaining the same amount of DPS from a pickaxe as you are from 3 daggers, even though 3 daggers is 750 gold and the pickaxe is what, 825 or something, 875. So we're talking about 125 less gold, and yet we're getting the same amount of DPS from it. Now again, if you think that Kaisa's AD ratio on her Q and her AD ratio on her W are more important. So if you're using your abilities in order to help your DPS, if you think that the AD ratio that you're getting on your Q and your W are more important than having more attack speed to help with your passive, I don't know whether those two things cancel out and are fairly equal, or whether the attack speed helping her passive is actually even stronger, which would even further amplify the idea that you should be going attack speed. But regardless, you can see that probably the way people are going about components on Kaisa, and it actually looks like her items curve pretty well, could be also potentially a little bit suspect. It's just very difficult, I think, without like either a very good Kaisa player feeling it out, or kind of testing it in practice tool with the Q, with the passive active, or getting into some math here with the passive and with the Q and that sort of thing, with some assumptions built in. We're obviously kind of at a sticking point here where it's like we can see that attack speed is probably more valuable than people think on Kaisa, because you probably don't see people opting to go triple dagger instead of pickaxe ever. But there are definitely plenty of situations. Let's say you're not getting an isolated Q, you're not pushing out your lane, and so you're unable to clear the minions and get the isolated Q. Maybe potentially in a lane where you're less likely to get the isolated Q, since these things are very equal, and we know that we're going to get more benefit from our passive if we have more attack speed. Maybe in that situation, the daggers is better. But you certainly almost never see anybody going like triple dagger or quadra dagger on Kaisa or any other AD carry for that matter. But this is definitely the case. Kaisa is probably also not the AD carry champion that benefits the most from attack speed, right? So now think about a champion that maybe benefits more from attack speed. A champion that really benefits from attack speed or something like that, that's got a lot of on-hit built into their kit, maybe a Varus or something like that, a Vayne. Maybe these champions that benefit even more and have maybe not as much in terms of AD ratios, maybe that would be more like Vayne, might benefit from, like, it might just be clear cut that going 4 daggers is better than pickaxe. So definitely things to keep in mind. I know that it's not quite as extensive and definitive as we would like. I'm just opening a can of worms here for people, that a lot of assumptions about what you're doing, whether it's Ruby Crystal being 4 times better than Cloth Armor, or 3 times better than No Magic Mantle, or whether it's 750 gold of daggers being, 3 daggers giving you the same DPS increase at level 1 on Kaisa as a pickaxe. Pretty interesting. Also keep in mind this is level 1, right? Remember, we get more of a benefit the higher level Kaisa goes from attack speed. So I bet if you were actually like level 9 when you're buying your pickaxe versus your daggers, although you're not going to be all the way at level 9. So again, you'd probably want to throw in a more realistic middling scenario. Okay, we're like level 4, 5, 6. We might actually, since these are even with each other coming down to the decimal, I'm sure that if you're level 4 or 5 or 6, you're benefiting more from the attack speed. So what's going to happen there? If in a real life situation in game, the truth is that if at level 4 or level 5 you go back on Kaisa and you buy 3 daggers, it's going to give you more DPS on your auto attacks than if you buy a pickaxe. Again, it's going to come down to that's still going to be really close, and it's going to come down to whether you get more damage from your Q and your W because you have the AD with the pickaxe versus if you get more damage with your passive from having the extra attack speed. That's really going to be the deciding factor, but I really think that's a very difficult thing to figure out for sure. So that's about where we're at with this. Hope that you guys learned something. Hope that we can keep pushing the boundaries of the way that people are building their component items and maybe even what items they're building in general. Like, had we looked at Kaisa's items and saw that she's building twice as much attack damage as she is attack speed, twice as much gold worth of attack damage as she is attack speed, and maybe she is actually when we start to get into some of the math on it. Maybe you start to even consider, like, how viable is it for her to build items that curve better? Because even though maybe it delays one of her evolves, or which I know that's like blasphemy because every Kaisa player is just going to build whatever items are going to give her evolves, but maybe you delay an evolve, but the benefit is that you get 10% higher DPS. I don't know. Is going invisible on your E on Kaisa really worth losing 10% of your DPS? Is getting to evolve W, right? And the main reason if you're AD Kaisa for evolving W would be to get the extra passive stack from it, which is to do what? It's to increase your DPS. Well, if you're increasing your DPS more by going a build that doesn't allow you to evolve W but gives you more attack speed, and so you're actually able to utilize your passive better anyways, then maybe that's just straight up better than having something that evolves your W. But the point is that maybe these items, actives or passives, just like I've been discovering on support, maybe their actives or passives are outweighed by another item that doesn't give you maybe the evolve or the active or passive that is like the best of any item, but it's like slightly, it's a slightly worse item passive, but it gives you 10% more DPS. Maybe that's worth it. These are the questions that we're asking. So with that being said, keep on your toes. Game's evolving rapidly right now. And good luck in solo queue and have a wonderful day.